So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm. Let me see. Turn this on. Just turn it on. I had this working before.
This is what I meant by technology failing in the human hands.
Yeah, so, well, I'll do it this way. Oh, huh. What a mystery. Okay, going the wrong direction. How about that? Okay, I'll do it by hand. Sorry. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I direct a small center here for social medicine and the humanities in the psychiatry department. I've been working for the, oh yeah, sure. I've been working for the past 20 years or so, or 25 years, with indigent populations, mostly in inner city. And this project that I'll be talking to you about today is a 12-year NIH-funded project with a network of homeless heroin addicts who were surviving under the freeways near the house where I lived in San Francisco. I used to be chair of social medicine at UCSF. And I followed them with a photographer and who became an anthropologist, is now a professor of anthropology. He was an undergraduate at the time. Well, it ended up being now until all of them have sadly passed away. And they this is one of, is a typical site inside one of their encampments. And I do generally warn people that I'm giving these lectures to that these photos are often shocking and upsetting and destabilizing. But I know many of you are either clinicians or work on health problems of social suffering and pathology. So I'm showing them to you because that's what you work in. And also, most importantly, I think when I present the material without showing the photographs, I sound like a raving maniac kook. It's so hard for people in the upper middle class and especially the clinical and public health worlds to even have the vaguest conception of what the infrastructural realities are in the natural environments of the people that they're often trying to serve, trying to help, and have a hard time wrapping their heads around why outcomes are so poor, especially for chronic behavioral conditions. And so the photographs then are actually meant to convey to you the ethnographic experience. This one is just to show you that I'm going to be talking about negative things and their suffering. There's also extraordinary human energy in the social network. You can see it in their faces, in their excitement at being the center of a study. They enjoyed the process and became very close to us, even as they tried to hustle us and so forth in that process, because that's the reality of their survival lives. And this is by the way, this is how photographs lie. Also, I was telling you, photographs tell you the objective truth. This is, Benetton doesn't exist anymore, but those of you that are old enough, I call it the Benetton photo lie. In fact, they're extraordinarily racist. Everything is understood. They're just American, after all. Everything is understood in these essentialized, racialized characters, and they focus on hating each other as much as or more than anything else, competing for resources, like most humans, based on insider and other types of divisions between people that get racialized. And so we use the classical participant observation methods of anthropology, which means deep hanging out is the popular way of saying it. And that did involve sleeping overnight in their encampments some of the time. I didn't do it as often as Jeff, who did it, who was very dedicated to the project. So just briefly, what I wanted to try to cover here today is just the utility of these simple concepts from anthropology and the social sciences of cultural relativism, expose you to the potential for ethnographic methods which are underrepresented in clinical research and in public health research, and supplement that with a more critical perspective on what I call structural vulnerability, and how that can be applied in very concrete, practical, fast ways for facilitating better treatment, care, and prevention. And then do this, of course, through this case study of this particular fieldwork project that I was working with. And specifically, the theme I'm going to be getting at is the contradictory priorities of the war on drugs, and how they conflict with public health priorities, clinical priorities of reducing pathologies, reducing infection, reducing suffering. And then just bring up the field of the approach of harm reduction, risk reduction, that is the standard approach in dealing with substance abuse. And then again, to get at the larger structural forces, the upstream forces, the more invisible forces, the more poorly understood forces that lead to such negative outcomes, what we call social determinants of health. I want to talk about this individual structural vulnerability in the larger structural risk environment, and I'll explain that that's the ulterior motive, that someone will be inspired to make an app for it to make it more accessible to a wider clinical population. But I'll explain that. I'll end with that and show you the preliminary checklist, we're calling it, because you have to simplify things for medicine. There's only 5 minutes in the contact with the patient, and you have to make a lot of money and so forth. So we want to make it accessible to clinicians so that they can actually use it and open up their mind and purview to the larger world out there, as opposed to how they've been trained to look at very narrow biological focus that won't really help them deal with most chronic conditions. So this particular concept of cultural relativism, it's actually very simple, commonsensical, and it's useful in any setting, whether one's a clinician, public health, or whatever, or a banker or a politician. It's basically a strategy, a heuristic tool, and it can be summed up that you basically put your sort of righteous, judgmental perspective on things to the side, and force yourself to step out of your common sense and understand that no culture, no social setting is inherently good or bad. It actually has its own logic for why it's doing things, and you just can't understand that logic if you see it as evil, pathological, or nonsensical. People universally think that they're in the right. We're all sociopaths in that sense, and we're trained to think that way through our cultures. So what we do makes a tremendous amount of sense to us, and that's why we don't understand one another and fight across cultures. So in that, and the strategy for that, which is much harder, especially in medicine where you're trained not to be humble, but to be an expert, to dominate everything, is this experience of humility. When you realize that you don't know what's going on in the logics of a homeless heroin addict, you have to throw out your expertise and you have to humble yourself as, hey, I'm this ignorant egghead cranium loser who's never tried drugs or anything. Tell me what's going on here. How do you take it? What do you like about it? And so forth. And so you look like a fool. You have to look like a fool. You have to know nothing in order to learn their logics from their perspectives. And having said that, and what often gets lost is to recognize the centrality of power and class relations in those interactions, and in all institutional clinical encounters. And so this concept of risk environment, I found is a strategy for opening up a quicker and more effective understanding of those complex forces that shape what get called, I'm sure you've heard of it as the social determinants of health. They're generally presented as a set of statistics and outcomes. And this, by understanding the risk environment behind that, you can actually open that black box of what it is that determines outcomes, what it is that determines racial disparities. And class disparities. A lot of it, when you stop and think about it, is common sense. The trouble is that in the sort of buffeting of the moment, especially in the kind of short clinical encounters that clinicians have, you basically just see the immediate emergency and can't step back and think of what an individual person might be facing in terms of structural forces that would make them be incapable of following the kinds of lifestyle changes that they're being asked to follow to address a chronic condition. So I just put up a bunch of there's an infinite number of them, and the challenge is figuring out which one is relevant and how to address it, what's addressable, and what can be addressed at. And so it's combining then that concept of the individual's vulnerability in that larger structural risk environment, I think that can offer a very practical way of operationalizing in a short period of time with the help of a heuristic tool like an assessment tool or checklist, so that one can address what is a seemingly intractable problem, and that medicine has up till now failed to be able to address, and has delegated to social workers to, and so forth, which means that it doesn't get done and there's no resources for it. And yet we're willing to spend extraordinary amounts of money in extraordinarily high-tech medicine and not on all the associated social services that might help. So I've listed again, individual dimensions of vulnerability. And obviously just straightforward, demographics in the context of a society that gets organized. Power relations get organized around socially relevant themes, gender, race, etc. But what I do want to emphasize is the invisibility in the United States, especially of social class. We have this ideology as an immigrant nation of you can get it if you really want, if you try. In fact, we have much less upward mobility patterns than most European countries. We're the country, as you probably know, that has higher social inequality and growing social inequality than most other wealthy industrial nations by a long shot. The other dimension is these are the ones that get recognized a little bit more in the sort of identity politics type of focus that the United States revolves around, which are relevant. These are structural vulnerabilities, but that tends to be what gets focused on, and the central obvious one of class gets forgotten about. So what I'm going to do is jump into some field notes to give you a little bit more of the sense of the ethnographic experience of what I'm talking about. And the notes are meant to evoke or show you that larger structural force of America's law enforcement set of priorities that dominate the reasons and logics for why injectors take such extraordinary, outrageous injection risks that confound us as clinicians, and that make us judge them as stupid for taking those risks, when in fact they have some very practical reasons, and there's some very structural forces that just override anything we try to do if we don't address that structural force of zero tolerance law enforcement. So I'll read this field note. Okay, this was taken by Jeff. There's been yet another round of evictions, and Hank is shivering on the corner at wit's end. He tells us, "The highway patrol wiped me out again." That means they bulldozed his shack, taking his blankets, grabbing the syringes that he had from the needle exchange, and all his clothes. put them in a dump truck in a garbage truck and ground them up. He adds, I'm tempted to get my gun and shoot the next patrol car that I see. That's his fantasy. He wants to be a masculine veteran, which he wasn't allowed into the army, but that's what his public persona is. And he's full of rage. Max walks into the encampment and puts his arm around Hank's shoulder. Max is attuned to Hank's dope sickness. That means his oncoming opiate withdrawal symptoms. And he offers to treat him to a, quote, taste of the heroin that he's just bought. They immediately set a candle on a pizza box and prepare to cook a bag of heroin. But Max's syringe jams. Hank reaches into his sock and pulls out another syringe, handing it to Max apologetically. The highway police took all my clean ones. Max shrugs. He was evicted from his encampment last week, too, and also lost all his clean syringes. But then he squints distastefully because Hank's syringe has been used so many times that the numbering on the chamber is worn off. Cursing, he also notes a burr on the tip of the needle. Hank grabs it back, licks the point to confirm the defect, and quickly files it down on a rock, alternately licking and filing until he can no longer feel the burr with his tongue. Max is the one treating, so Hank deferentially hands the needle back to Max and eagerly waits for his turn to prepare with what they call a cotton shot from the leftovers that are going to be in the bottom of that crushed beer can that they were dissolving the heroin and liquefying the heroin. Now, believe it or not, they understood, all the heroin addicts that we worked with understood very well what the vectors of HIV, hepatitis C were, and had a good sense of actually had a good sense of the risks they were taking. In those particular practices, objectively, you're not likely to get anything except hepatitis C and soft tissue infections, HIV. Well, actually, no. Hank there very easily could get HIV because he was directly using the same dirty needle. But that was a very exceptional level of risk. And it occurred only because they were in the midst of a round of especially persistent highway patrol cleanouts, so to speak. Most of the time, they were able to access the needle exchange and obtain needles, and they were able to avoid using direct needle sharing, which is the highest risk for any infection. And most of the time, they were able to rinse at least their needles with water, even if it was filthy water, between when they did reuse someone's needle. And also, they often re-rinse their own needle out. You do see they store it in their sock, and that's of course because then the police are less likely to find it. And at that time, you were getting thrown in jail for carrying a needle in California. They've changed that law now. So what's interesting, of course, is if you put sort of our general sort of cultural logic, scientific, that we think of as scientific, that we think of as moral, that we think of as commonsensical, that what we saw there was, idiotic behavior that gives you HIV, hepatitis, and abscess, just absolutely incomprehensible behavior. How could you possibly lick the tip of the needle? That's where all your bacteria are in your mouth. In fact, it's a super smart thing to do if you want to be sure that you're not going to miss your shot. If there's a burr there, it's not going to go in right. You can make the whole worse, complicate the injection, and most importantly, you can lose the effects of the drugs if you can't effectively inject it. And that's your priority, into your vein, to keep away dope sickness and to give you the sense of a moment of ecstasy that you crave through your addiction. Now, in terms of their understanding of it, though, it's even more extraordinary in the sense that they think of that form of sharing as a moral obligation. to one another. You don't leave someone who's starting to shake and show the signs of heroin withdrawal, because those symptoms, if anyone has ever seen it, are absolutely agonizing. It's incomprehensible to those of us that haven't been through heroin withdrawal to understand what it feels like. But people talk about it as literally hitting your head against the wall, to have some pain over here so that you don't feel the generalized pain throughout your body, because your cells just aren't functioning. None of them are doing what they're supposed to be doing, because they're not getting the opiates that they need to function. So now, at that time, I don't want to glorify homeless heroin addicts. They also do it manipulatively, and that's the very important part of it, because by sharing, you're protecting yourself from finding yourself in heroin withdrawal, unable to find anyone who's willing to take the risk of sharing a little bit of heroin with you, with the knowledge that eventually you'll pay them back when they find themselves unable to generate money. And so they survive then in what anthropologists have been calling, anthropologists developed this in the 1930s to try to understand societies that were in the market economy. How is it that things got distributed? And they discovered that there's this extraordinary amount of gift giving that takes place. And that a gift is not a gift. A gift is an obligation for return. A gift is actually, when you give something to someone, you actually have power over them, because they now are obliged to pay a gift to you. In fact, if you stop and think about it to yourselves, you know that's the case in your life. If you tend to give a more expensive present to a wealthier friend, you give a more expensive present to someone who's giving you a better present, and so forth. You do that unconsciously. It is a kind of a human universal reciprocity. It isn't a cynical thing or anything like that. It's just the nature of social relations and mutuality. And so they are that's one of the strategies they have then to deal with their precarity. And I'll just go through a little bit of Heroin 101, because the utility of understanding the logistics of it are actually super important for understanding how one could do. How much time do I have? Okay, so this is what the heroin here is, Mexican black tar. It's called. It's a crummy. It's good quality, great quality in terms of the amount of heroin inside it, but it's a very difficult to deal with substance, sort of waxy and gooey and difficult. You can't cut it with a razor blade easily to divide it up. So they have to just liquefy it when they want to divide it up in an even way. And they want to know how much each person is giving, because that determines who's being generous and who owes how much to who in the future. So they actually look at the amount of units in each one of that are drawn up into the syringe. And it's hard. That's why the photo is useful. If I told you they dissolve it in beer cans, you would just think I was exaggerating. But that's the reality of the infrastructure that they're working in. And this material needs to be often needs to be fully liquefied. Has to be actually crushed with the back of your syringe there, another filthy object if you've been carrying it in your sock, in order to make sure all the precious material has been dissolved into the water. And then you throw cotton into it. That was the reference to the cotton shots, so that the larger residues of things don't get in and block your needle tip and also cause a problem when injected into you. So that little piece of soggy cotton at the end becomes a valuable object that often gets given to people that are in withdrawal symptoms. It's also a great place to be filthy. It's by nature is the dregs of the project. And then you see a picture like this, and this was my reaction to it. I'm not any different from anyone else. You see this and you go, what the heck is going through his mind to be injecting there in such a filthy place? Does he hate himself to be doing that? Why doesn't he care about his health? What's going on? One's reaction is of revulsion. In fact, when you stop and think about this, and this is very easy to figure out now that you understand their logics in the context of law enforcement, this is basically the safest place you can inject in America. No cop in his or her right mind is going to run into this place, which is surrounded by a huge puddle of water with the rainy season. It stinks and smells. It's disgusting. You're simply not going to, you're not paid enough to run through there, slip in the mud. And so his priority is not to be arrested in the midst of an injection and then find himself thrown into the county jail, entering into withdrawal symptoms for several days until the judge finally throws him out because he's throwing up all over the place. The judge doesn't want to gum up the system with non-criminal offenders. So that is what a shooting gallery looks like in the United States. It's a rational place to shoot. This is what a shooting gallery looks like in Canada. It's a safe injection site. That's the standard for harm reduction now in many European countries and in countries that have tamed the power of law enforcement priorities and brought public health priorities to the forefront to reduce, especially heroin overdoses. Safe injection sites are most useful for heroin overdose prevention. And in Canada, they do it. They even have a nurse practitioner overlooking everyone, and so forth. So you probably know about harm reduction, and if you don't, it's actually useful not just for drugs, but for any behaviorally related types of pathologies. And these are, of course, some of the successful programs that are used, some in the United States, like needle exchange, although most states, in the vast majority of states, needle possession is illegal. This one is a mind-boggler for Americans, and we don't get presented it through the media. It's like a taboo. But Switzerland, since the 1990s, distributes pure heroin to its, has the option of pure heroin for its heroin addicts. And they find that by distributing pure heroin to the heroin addicts, they decrease their suicide rates, their violence rates, their arrest rates, and have a higher proportion of them going into pure abstinence than they do from the methadone programs and the abstinence programs. Because the person is all of a sudden getting what they want, and they start to get bored with it, start having time to figure out what the hell is the matter with me, that I'm throwing my whole life away, don't have my kids, don't have my family. And so I'll stop now and just put up this structural vulnerability assessment tool in case you get inspired. And these slides will be up afterwards, but it fits on one page, but we structured them this way. So sorry for
Philippe. So I'm always humbled and awed when I see what you see. We have these idealized visions of our patients. This is a terrific idea. I do want to give some time for you. There are some of you who work with addiction questions. There are field experiences here that we rarely find. Are there questions that we can, from your own studies? Let me begin by, so I work with vulnerable populations, and it's, you're picking them up and bringing them, trying to track them. They carry 2 phones, but this is a completely different level. It's like, what advice would you have for people who are trying to come up with sensors and apps to track these people? How do we know that they will not sell them on the street for the next fix?
So this field work was before the smartphone. The technology that they were using to buy their drugs was with beepers, and they did hold on to beepers. The beeper was what enabled them to call the drug dealer or to have contractors call them when they wanted a piece of wood stolen for a construction site and so forth. Get beeped, and then they would go to a payphone and call. So they had the ability to interface when they could see the practical utility of it. In my current field work, since the smartphone era, it's now been with heroin sellers and crack sellers in inner city Philadelphia. I just moved to Los Angeles 2 years ago. They managed their Facebook accounts. They don't have computers, but they managed their Facebook accounts through their smartphones. They were constantly losing and selling and unable to pay their accounts but they managed to find millions of companies that they kept getting new smartphones from. I didn't know that that existed as a possibility. And what was interesting to see is that even though most of them would be called functionally illiterate, and they often read, many of them had read the Bible or parts of the Bible, but that was basically the extent of their relationship to reading. They did maintain Facebook pages, and they use that as their they stay in touch with us through that now. And actually, a lot of the law enforcement interventions are because they put up too much information on Facebook. Sort of naively. So there is actually a huge space for technology, and there is, they will sell whatever they need when they're sick, but there is also a sense of practicality for when it's in their interest, when they're paid to keep it, and when they can also go after that in some sense. But questions from?
So have you targeted the assessment tool to anyone in particular, or had any success with?
So thank you for asking that. We published it it came out this year in academic medicine. We wanted to introduce it. We thought it would be sort of have an upstream effect, is to introduce it in the medical school training moment when people are still idealistic and not yet in their super specialties, making too much money to care about this kind of population. And so that's basically where we've been focusing to introduce the medical school curriculum. Where we've had the most uptake, however, is at the residency level. And so there are certain residencies. The ideas of it is that you have to completely adapt it to your specific population, because it's not a one-size-all-fits, and that's why we tried to structure it with the general domains, and then an example of a type of semi-neutral question, and then some options for probing below. But it would need to be adapted in each case in that sense. The problem, of course, is that no one wants another bureaucratic imposition of time use in some sense. But we have had, so in that sense, it's at this early stage and up for grabs, in the hope that it's up for grabs. You take one more.
Yeah. So, sorry. So when a new study is being designed, it's really important to go in and understand the viewpoint of the intended audience. So I consider ability for this ethnographic approach for understanding feasibility and acceptability.
Right.
But on the flip side, there's also these emphases now where you need to have patient stakeholders as part of the team. So what maybe is unique about having an anthropologist on the team to help us do all these versus somebody who might be for social health and public health? What's kind of an approach?
So basically, the training in anthropology that seems, in my experience, to come the hardest for people that aren't in anthropology is that cultural relativism, humility, in some sense. So what happens often is that the more service-oriented disciplines are intervening on the person in a way that say, I know what you're supposed to do. I know how you're supposed to inject. This is how I want you to inject the right way. I care about you. I like you. I want to keep you alive. So the anthropology, it's the ability to step back, and it's a difficult ethical stance because you want to intervene, and at the same time, when you intervene, you chase the person away. And you fail to see why this isn't making sense to the person. So that's why I emphasize that sort of simple common sense of, what looks like simple common sense of cultural relativism. So it is an ability to have a self-critical perspective and not trust what you're seeing. You're also aware that you're constantly
imposing your own reality on what you see, because that's the nature of humans, that we're born into culture and we can only see things through the perspective of the common sense of our culture, and so it's that impossible thing of trying to step out of your culture and not be distracted by it in some sense.
Perfect, Philip. Thank you.